In this video, we'll talk about protest letters. What exactly is a protest letter? And I'll even show you how to write a protest letter to the IRS. In the federal system, at the conclusion of an audit, if the IRS believes there is a tax owing, the IRS will send the taxpayer a preliminary notice of deficiency. Now, you have to think about the whole audit process and whatnot, and if the IRS receives a notice from the IRS basically saying that you owe taxes, that we don't agree with the amount, then the protest letter is basically a response, okay? And the letter that the IRS sends is often referred to as a 30-day letter because the taxpayer has 30 days to accept, respond, or do nothing. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes what the 30-day letter, what it looks like. One important response option is filing a written protest of the IRS agent's findings. This is referred to as a protest letter, and again, that's the purpose of this video. Again, it's in response to the 30-day letter, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, what exactly the protest letter it gets at with respect to what you're doing in the process, because it's continuing the process of disputing the claim by the IRS with respect to the taxpayer. In the protest letter, the taxpayer may request an appeal of the revenue agent's determination by submitting a written protest with the Office of Appeals. So that is the purpose of a protest letter. It is for the taxpayer to request an appeal of the revenue agent's determination by submitting a written protest with the Office of Appeals. Now, the Office of Appeals is separate from the revenue agent, and it's meant to be an unbiased, a fresh look at your return information, okay? They are part of the IRS, but they are a separate department, and they're supposed to be unbiased in the sense of looking at what the revenue agent found and also the information that you provide, how you present the facts, how you present the authorities, those things, okay? So keep that in mind. And by the way, the appeals process is not the last process in terms of the controversy process of the IRS. You know, if a taxpayer is disputing a claim by the IRS. There's also the ability to go to tax court, but you're going to notice that it's very, very, very important, and you're going to see in the 30-day letter, this is hashed out, that you do consider the appeals process, because it's possible that the taxpayer could actually be charged by the federal government. So you have to pay the federal government money up to a certain amount if not all avenues are taken. And this is one of them, going through the appeals process. It's basically a way so that we don't flood the court system. You've all heard about how the court systems in the United States are flooded, and this is a process to kind of alleviate that. It's like, think about it like the appeals process is before you go to court, okay, to help with that, okay? Now, the protest letter should be completed and mailed to the IRS revenue agent, not the Office of Appeals. And you're saying, well, what do you mean? I thought this is meant to request an appeals, and it is. But the idea is that, as you know, with the IRS, it's so large and there's so many different divisions, and it's so difficult to keep track of everything. It needs to be sent to the IRS revenue agent in order to track that and keep track of the respective tax issue, okay? And the Office of Appeals, again, they're a separate department, and if they and what you're going to notice if you look at the structure of the IRS is that you might have different divisions in different cities, different regions and whatnot. The Office of Appeals, they will make up multiple divisions and multiple regions and whatnot. So maybe you have, let's say you're in the state of Florida, and you've got, the South Florida, you've got Central Florida, you've got, Northern Florida. Well, the appeals office will represent the whole state of Florida as well as maybe even other states. So that's the idea, is that you have to think about the different resources that go into the IRS. And the Office of Appeals is not as big as the entire audit process of the revenue agents and whatnot. So keep that in mind. That's why you're doing this. The case goes to appeals officer after a protest is filed. So the protest letter, it basically says, I want to be considered before the Office of Appeals. And again, this is a very powerful process, okay? I'll talk more about it when we look at the 30-day letter in just a minute. The appeals office has complete authority to settle the case. Okay, now they have, bounds that they're set by the IRS. They can't just say, oh yeah, well, the taxpayer doesn't want to pay anything, and and the IRS wants them to pay a lot of money. There might be some wiggle room there. That's the idea there, to settle a case so that they don't. The idea again is that we don't really want to have to worry about the resources on the court system. Because imagine all the court cases that would go before the tax court in the United States and whatnot, thinking about a federal tax. To minimize the cost of litigation in both time and money, appeals is a strong option to consider. There's a big push on the government side, but there's also a big push on the taxpayer side, because going through the process of going to tax court, while you can represent yourself, it's not advisable, and paying an attorney and paying the filing fee to go before the tax court and all these different things, or other different, I keep mentioning tax court, other courts like the federal court of claims or federal district court, this all costs lots of money and lots of time, okay? So the appeals process can help alleviate those issues. Now, I also mentioned in here that a lot of states, they follow a similar process with respect to the state income taxes and state taxes. So just keep that in mind, that we're looking at federal, but states a lot of times have a similar system. Okay, let's go ahead and let's look at the 30-day letter before we continue looking at the protest letter in these items. So here's an example of a 30-day letter, and this is very generic. I didn't put any specifics in there, of course, because I don't want to put any information, but this is kind of a very, very, very similar structure to what the IRS sends out. Okay, it's somewhere on the form. We're just going to go from top to bottom. And again, this is the 30-day letter. This is not the protest letter. So the idea is that taxpayer's representative gets his 30-day letter from the IRS, and in response to the 30-day letter, you have multiple options that you'll see, the taxpayer's representative, and one of those is to file a formal protest, known as a protest letter, which, remember, is basically to say, I want to go before the appeals. I want to go before IRS appeals, okay? So let's just take a look at the 30-day letter, because it has a lot of important information. It talks about why it's called a 30-day letter. It talks about different options. It also talks about making sure you consider all the different avenues, because there is an option to skip the appeals process and go to the court, but if tax court or federal district court, federal district court wouldn't be an issue because you're paying the federal, you're suing for a refund. But if you went to tax court, the court could rule against you and not using, the appeals process, using all the avenues to basically make sure that you don't have to use the resources of government is the idea. So let's just go through. Somewhere on the letter, it's going to say notice of adjustment, 30-day letter. It might not say 30-day letter. You'll get the idea from the actual letter itself. Of course, it's going to be addressed by the IRS Department of Treasury. It's going to have date. It's going to have social security number or the EIN number or some identification number for the taxpayer. It's going to have the tax year ended, because you might get this letter in the mail and it might be a certain year and the IRS might have audited, 6 or 7 years ago. So just keep that in mind. Person to contact, that's most likely going to be the revenue agent. So keep that in mind. Contact telephone number they provide. Now, one thing that you always hear with the IRS is that usually they will not contact you by phone, and that is true. That's usually initial correspondence, because there's just so much identity theft out there with telephones and whatnot. The idea here is usually something comes officially through the mail, and then once this process gets rolling, at some point a telephone can be used, so a contact telephone number is provided, and as well as contact address. So dear blank, dear taxpayer, dear name of the entity, whatever it is. Enclosed are 2 copies of our report explaining why we believe adjustments should be made in the amount of your tax. Please look over this report and let us know whether you agree with our findings. So you're looking at these reports, which are just copies, by the way, just 2 copies, and a lot of times they provide 2 copies. So if you have a taxpayer and taxpayer representative, you can have the 2 copies. But of course, if it's representative, they're going to be making, putting this in their file and whatnot. But that's in the past kind of why that, you might be wondering why exactly 2 copies, because of the representative and you have the taxpayer, okay? So there's going to be, from the way this is written out, there's obviously, it's already setting out there might be multiple options allowed. The taxpayer, they might agree, because it might not be that big of a deal. It might be a huge deal, and they might say, well, I disagree, and you can see the different options laid out. If you accept our findings, please sign the consent to assessment and collection portion at the bottom of the report and mail 1 copy to this office within 30 days, so that's 30-day letter, from the date of this letter. If additional tax is due, you might want to pay it now and limit the interest charge. Otherwise, we will bill you. And publication 5 might be provided. If not, more in the future, publication 5 might not be provided. It might just be referenced. So you can look it up online. Of course, government's trying to be evergreen and save money in terms of, and as well save the environment, not printing out stuff. But the main thing to note here is the issue of the interest. That's one thing to consider with respect to interest. If you don't pay taxes and then you ultimately owe, if let's say you go through the court process and it's years after this initial assessment and then you lose, you do have to pay interest on that amount, just so you know. But that's a cost of going through this process. And if you win, the government has to pay you tax if you were to pay a refund, okay? And then they give back to you with interest. If you do not accept our findings, you have 30 days from the date of this letter to do one of the following. Mail us any additional evidence or information you would like us to consider. Request a discussion of our findings with the examiner who conducted the examination. At that time, you may submit any additional evidence or information you would like us to consider. If you plan to come in for discussion, please phone or write us in advance so that we can arrange a convenient time and place. And finally, discuss your position with the group manager or senior examiner if an examination has been held and you have been unable to reach an agreement with the examiner. Okay? Now, those options, you'll notice nothing has to do with appeals so far, but they are giving you some options in terms of communicating with the revenue agent as well as the group manager or senior examiner if the contact person was a lower level examiner. If you do not accept our findings and do not want to take any of the actions above, they give you more options. You may write us at the address shown above or call us at the telephone number shown within 30 days from the date of this letter to request a conference with an appeals officer. This is the protest letter. So this part right here, if you do not accept our findings and do not want to take any of the actions above, right, those 3 bullet points, you may write us at the address shown above or call us at the telephone number shown above within 30 days from the date of this letter to request a conference with an appeals officer. That is the protest letter, that letter that you file. You must provide to the examiner all pertinent documentation and facts concerning disputed issues before your case is forwarded to the appeals officer. So the idea here is, remember, keeping everything in the file, the revenue agent that examined your process, so they can forward it to appeals if that's what you request as your right to a taxpayer. You have to also provide information so that appeals can review this, because appeals, remember, they are a separate division in the IRS. They're going to consider what the revenue agent, their law, what they found, and they're also going to consider the law that you provide. And from that, they're going to make a decision. They're going to go through the process and they're going to give you what they can do. Whether they agree with the IRS, whether they agree with you, it might be somewhere in the middle, and they might have the ability to settle, and it might be more favorable to you, it might not be favorable to you. If your examination was conducted entirely by mail, we would appreciate your first discussing our findings with one of our examiners. The appeals office is independent, so that's where I was saying it's independent of the district director. The appeals officer, who had not examined your return previously, will take a fresh look at your case. So they want to make sure you understand this is an unbiased process. Most disputes considered by appeals are resolved informally and promptly. Again, the idea here is we don't want you to be wasting the resources of the government going all the way to the courts and making, the Office of Chief Counsel, the IRS, which they have already a limited number of attorneys doing thousands of cases a year, right, before the tax court. So they're already overburdened with cases. They're trying to establish a process that's going to make it more informal and it's going to be more prompt, so you don't have to worry and all the headache of this stuff. So it's benefit for the government and the taxpayer. By going to appeals, you may avoid court costs, such as the U.S. tax court filing fee, clear up this matter sooner, and prevent interest from mounting. An appeals officer will promptly telephone you. Again, that's the idea of the telephone. So at this process, telephone can be a way the IRS contacts you. And if necessary, arrange and let's go to the next page, an appointment. If you decide to bypass appeals and petition the tax court, this is really important. Your case will normally be assigned for settlement to an appeals office before the tax court hears the case. So even if you bypass appeals, still it goes before the appeals office. And the reason why that is the next paragraph, and that's going to bring in a huge red flag for you to understand that if you don't go through the protest letter. Under Internal Revenue Code Section 6673, so those code sections in the 6000 that deal with procedural issues, the tax court is authorized to award damages up to $25,000. And in the future, if you're watching this video, it might even be more. To the United States, when a taxpayer unreasonably fails to pursue available administrative remedies. So the idea is that if a taxpayer just says from day one, when they get a letter from the IRS examiner saying, hey, we did an audit and we see this issue and you owe money because we think there's a deficiency. It's an adjustment that we're making. Well, if you are not willing to talk to them or even consider appeals, at a minimum, consider appeals, another division, it's possible if you go before a tax court because you just hold out and use, I want tax court, I want tax court, I want tax court, and it's so clear that it's blatant and you did not try, the tax court could rule against you an additional up to $25,000 at the time of this video, could be more in the future, award that you have to pay the federal government because you did not use the proper channels. Now, it seems scary. The tax court does not do this often, but it's still something to consider. Still something very important to consider, okay? Especially given the circumstances of your type of taxpayer. More business entities, more likely to have this issue. But if it's, obviously individuals pro se and they don't understand things, maybe not the case. But if your taxpayer is represented by attorneys, represented by CPAs, enrolled agents, tax professionals, right? This needs to be considered. And it also could potentially get you in trouble as a tax representative if you're representing a taxpayer and you don't go through this and you don't consider these issues, because if the taxpayer does have to pay this, they might sue you and say, hey, you did not warn me about this issue. So keep this in mind. Damages could be awarded under this provision, for example, if the court concludes that it was unreasonable for the taxpayer to bypass appeals and then file a petition in the tax court. So that's an example. The tax court will make that determination based upon the facts and circumstances of each case. Generally, the service will not ask the court to award damages under this provision if you make a good faith effort to meet with appeals and to settle your case before petitioning the tax court. So they're not saying that you have to settle. They're just saying you're making a good faith effort going through the channels. Now, keep in mind that this amount that you have to pay, up to $25,000 at the time of this video, this is separate from any amount you might have to pay the IRS if you actually lose the issue. This is a separate issue, okay? This is a separate additional amount you might have to pay. So keep that in mind. The enclosed publication 5 explains your appeals rights. Now, again, that could be, they might just reference it electronically. If we do not hear from you within 30 days, we will have to process your case on the basis of adjustments shown in the examination report. If you write us about your case, please write to the person whose name and address are shown in the heading, again, the revenue agent or examining agent of this letter, and refer to the symbols. They usually give you symbols that's a specific identification for your issue in the upper right corner of the enclosed report. An envelope is enclosed for your convenience. Please include your telephone number, area code, most convenient time for us to call in case we find it necessary to contact you for further information. Again, there's the telephone issue. If you prefer, you may call the person at the telephone number shown in the heading of this letter. This person will be able to answer any questions you may have. Thanks for your cooperation, IRS examinations, and they provide some enclosures with the examination report, publication 5 envelope. Again, publication 5 going forward might be more electronic. That examination report is going to have information about what the rationale is, specifically how the IRS is coming to the result. Now, in my experience, as well as other tax practitioners that I know, there's times where you might have a revenue agent that provides a lot of information or a little bit. And unfortunately, that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. You might get an issue where the revenue agent just says, you know what, we disagree with you, and we just cite a code section, right? We're going to disallow this loss because it does not meet the criteria of code section 165 and does not really give you much information, okay? Well, in that regard, I mean, when it goes to appeals, I mean, that's going to look favorably on your end, but you still, if you're filing the protest letter, you want to provide as much information and make your case. You just don't want to do the same thing they did and say, well, I disagree because 165 says I disagree and I think that 165 says the opposite is you, and that's all you say. You don't want to necessarily just mimic them because you feel that they're not acting in good faith or whatnot. You want to still continue with this process. And also understand the IRS, the monumental task they have to deal with all the different taxpayers we have and all the different issues with, limited funds and limited resources. You have to commend them at times, especially when there's huge changes in tax law of what they have to do, what they have to deal with. It's very stressful and a lot of work. So keep that in mind, that sometimes it's not necessarily in bad faith. It's just that they're limited in resources and time. And they're just dealing with so many different issues. Let's go back now to our protest letter information to talk about what exactly goes into a protest letter, as well as I'll show you an example. And I want to talk to you about exactly how to be an advocate for your party, for the taxpayer, when you're writing this different report. All right, so we've already completed the first paragraph. We looked at a 30-day letter. We saw that. Now let's go to the next paragraph. Taxpayers are required to file a written protest in certain situations. So this protest letter is required in certain situations, and I list them. Okay, I deal with certain employee plan exempt cases, and these are not all of them, by the way. There's other situations, but these are some examples. So certain areas of tax law, partnership S corporation cases without regard to the dollar amount, and then there's a dollar amount involved. If there is a certain monetary amount in terms of the adjustment, as in terms of the amount of interest, those types of things, then penalties, then a protest letter is required. Even if a protest letter is not required, and again, those three different items I give you, those examples, which you can read, right? Employee plan, exempt organizations, partnership S corporation, and then it doesn't qualify for the special small case procedures before a tax court, which means a certain amount, which that's changed over the years. Well, there's other situations that it might be required. But even if it's not required, the protest letter is still advisable to submit in many cases. Again, the purpose of the protest letter is to get that Office of Appeals, and with filing a protest letter, that again, going back to the 30-day letter where you're trying to exhaust all avenues in good faith, by filing the protest letter, it shows a written record that you actually are trying to go through this process. So even if it's not required, it might be advisable to still do the protest letter. The purpose of the protest letter, which we talked about already, it's quite different than any other type of tax communication with a internal memo, for example, or client file. Specifically, you're dealing with the IRS. So where you're dealing with an internal memo or client, a lot of times, you're playing both sides of the coin, or you're playing devil's advocate. You're saying, okay, well, I think the taxpayer should or is able to take the deduction more likely than not, but just so you know, there's some arguments for why they cannot take the deduction, and here's why. Here's the different authorities. When it comes to anything before the IRS, you're able to be an advocate, and you don't have to provide both sides. That's the other side, the IRS. That's their job to do. Okay, remember, this protest letter is going to be before the appeals officer, and they're considering both the revenue agent's information as well as your information, and they might be doing their own research as well. Okay, but that's the IRS's obligation. You're not required in any way to provide both sides. Nothing says that. When you think about being an advocate, maybe like a lawyer representing before a court, nothing says you have to say both sides of the argument. You just have to show your side, and you have to make an effort to explain why your argument is the better argument. That's obvious. That's what you're doing. And that the art of advocacy, it deals not only with presenting the information, presenting the law that applies to you, presenting that, but also the way you present your facts, okay? So the art of advocacy requires an altogether different tone than the other types of written communication. That being said, your skills in writing a memo, your skills in writing a client letter, those are still essential. You cannot let those go, especially the memo, especially that internal memo. That is the heart of all tax research and writing, okay? Where the tone of an internal memo and client letter is fairly objective, informative, and you're educating, in a protest letter, you need to be more assertive and politely argumentative. Your goal is to convince the reader that the taxpayer's position is correct, as long as you are professionally comfortable that your client has a realistic basis, because you have to think about the issues of liability and penalties, okay? To assert the position, your personal opinion becomes somewhat irrelevant when you are in the role of a taxpayer advocate. Okay, so it's no longer about educating, what the different arguments are or whatnot. It is you are taking the role of a taxpayer, and as long as you professionally feel that argument is realistic, has a realistic basis, you have to just go with that argument. Even if because you're representing a taxpayer, and ultimately the taxpayer is the one that gets to pick the argument to present, as long as it's has a reasonable basis, you have to present that. And even if you feel like, oh, there's a better argument, sorry, not better argument, but a better outcome or answer that should be argued, well, unfortunately, that's irrelevant. So the protest letter, it follows the same basic structure of the internal memo and client letter purpose. And I'm going to show you an example of one later. And if you're asked to ever write a protest letter, whether it's for your client or you're in a tax research and writing class, if you're in my tax writing class, tax research class, you can just basically follow the format, because one thing when you're dealing with the IRS is that you want to keep the format very, very similar to their structure, which the example I'm going to provide you in a few minutes, you're going to see is very much, it follows that letter like the IRS, kind of like the 30-day letter where it's like numbered and everything. You can follow that exact format, okay? You can just follow it, obviously filling in the information for your issue, okay? So going back to the structure. So there's facts, issues, conclusion, and reasoning. All that stuff's going to be in the protest letter as well. However, the role of the client advocate often carries with it greater formality, such as the need to obtain and file appropriate powers of attorney with the IRS. So you need to make sure you put all proper power of attorney forms, all that stuff in there, because if you present something to the IRS and you're representing the taxpayer and you don't do that, then unfortunately they're not even going to be able to look at that because you haven't provided those proper channels. So there's a lot more formality that goes on. With the tone of an advocate, you must state that your purpose is to protest the findings of the revenue agent. So that is why it's called the protest letter. You are basically making a plea to the again, a separate division, the appeals office, basically saying, no, we protest the findings of the revenue agent, and here's why. Okay? And you need to lay out the important facts. Again, you're able to present the facts a way that's favorable to your client. We'll talk about that. But you also need to present the argument for why you're arguing that way. Sometimes the agent presents incomplete facts or law that are potentially misleading. You should present the facts and law thoroughly and honestly, but in the most favorable light for the taxpayer's position. So you are not able to manipulate and lie, but you are able to present it a certain way, okay? It is not your job to represent the IRS's position, so you're not in any way required to show the other, the appeals office, the other side's argument. That's for them to do. The challenge for a practitioner in written communications with the tax agency is to present the taxpayer's case in such a way that the desired result will naturally flow from the recipient. Accomplishing this requires pegging the facts to the code, regulations, or case law. This should be done in a non-confrontational manner. For example, in an appeals protest letter, avoid casting aspersions on a revenue agent or the revenue agent's work. So the idea is you do not want to put in the letter, you don't want to basically talk bad about the revenue agent and say this is ridiculous what they did. Again, understand there are many times where these revenue agents are just bogged down with work and they're not able to hash out the full argument. Okay? So maybe they leave out things. Instead, point out the correct tax law to be applied and allude to the fact that the agent may have overlooked a provision or fact in reaching the agent's decision. The practitioner is simply helping the appeals officer come to the right conclusion. That's what you're doing. You're basically guiding as an advocate for your side, but guiding the appeals officer to explain why you feel that your argument is a better argument and why it should come out that way. Another thing is going back to don't cast negative light on the IRS and the revenue agent, is because this is your professional reputation on the line. Yeah, you're dealing with this for a client, and yeah, you have an advocate, but you might be dealing with this revenue agent and this appeals officer many, many times over and over, and you want to come across as very professional because this is your career. Now let's consider an example of posing facts. Remember I told you about posing facts in a favorable light to your taxpayer, because when it comes to the facts in the client letter, when it comes to the facts in the internal memo, we just presented the facts as they are. But we need to talk about how to present the facts in a positive manner as an advocate of the taxpayer. So let's hear the actual facts. Assume that Mr. X took a code section 162, which is a general business deduction, for expenses, maintenance, depreciation, interest connected with the home that he owns for investment purposes. So he's owning it for investment purposes, but he's taking code section 162 deduction. He purchased, which is a business expense. He purchased the home 5 years ago at a cost of $100,000 and has never lived or vacationed in it. He has rented the home out from time to time, although he did not rent it out during the tax year in question. The home was listed with a rental agent, But because of poor weather, so think about maybe, snowstorms or, really bad weather, no rental arrangements were made. The home was rented out in subsequent years. The home is presently valued at $500,000. Mr. X's primary reason for owning the home is ultimately to sell it and benefit from its significant appreciation in value since purchase. He has also thought that he and his wife might eventually wish to retire and move into the home, even though, again, he's never lived in it. Considering the actual facts, so these are the actual facts given to you. The following may be how the revenue agent may present facts in the most unfavorable light to the taxpayer. So they might say in their report, right, that comes with a 30-day letter, Mr. X took a Code Section 162 deduction for expenses incurred in connection with the residence in year 20X0. The residence was not rented to any non-family member during the year or used for any other business purpose, which is going to lead them to obviously disallow the deduction. Okay? But that's not necessarily true. They've left out things, right? Considering the actual facts, now let's present those facts above, right, in the most favorable light to the taxpayer. So this is how you would write that. Mr. X purchased residential property in 20X0 for $100,000. It is currently valued at $500,000. Since the time of purchase, neither the taxpayer nor his family have ever used the home for personal purposes. The home has frequently been rented to non-family members since the time of purchase at full rental value. During 20X0, the home was listed with a rental agent and efforts were continually made to rent out the home. However, due to the poor weather during the vacation months, the efforts to rent in 20X0 were unsuccessful. The home was rented out in 20X1 and 20X2. So that's leading more to, the arguments of business deduction and whatnot. Now we're going to come back to that example of Mr. X in a few minutes. Note that the agent presenting the facts in an unfavorable light does not make any misstatements. However, many of the favorable facts are not presented, so the agent does not present those. The presentation of facts more favorably does not misstate facts either. However, it provides information that helps explain the facts more fully in a helpful vein to the taxpayer because it helps provide more facts that get to the point of why business deductions should be allowed. The favorable example also omits facts that are best left unstated but that are not material. For example, the future possibility the taxpayer may use the home for personal purposes. Again, that's not important because you're looking at the years at issue, but it could, obviously affect the thinking of that appeals officer or the court or whatnot, even though they shouldn't be thinking that. Although you can presume your reader is a sophisticated tax practitioner with the IRS, you should still carefully explain the issue by identifying the code section involved, its requirements, and the questions at hand. So remember, when you're writing a memo, a lot of times we say, or client letter, that we don't make any assumptions about the person you're writing to because for the memo, you want to show how you got to your points. You want to show the full process. And for the client letter, well, your client isn't a tax practitioner, right? Or else they'd probably be doing this themselves. Okay. Well, with the IRS, the other side, right, when you're writing this protest letter, does understand tax law, but keep in mind that you still don't want to leave anything, any stone unturned. You want to show everything because you're still having to submit it to this appeals officer. Okay. Then you must carefully and convincingly discuss all relevant authority and explain why an analysis of the authority results in a conclusion that your taxpayer's position was the correct one. You should confront any negative authority and explain why it's inapplicable. Either that the facts are distinguishable or that the reasoning is in some way it should not apply to your taxpayer. It is even advisable to use firm language like clearly. So one thing I note when I teach my memo writing is that you don't use firm language like clearly or it is clear, things like that make it like 100%. Because, the facts that I give with the issues, it's not clear. There's going to be arguments for both sides, or there's at least, a small argument for each side, right? I don't make it clear. If it was clear, then you probably wouldn't be being asked by the taxpayer a lot of times at least. So here you can use that, and it's recommended that you do because, again, you're being an advocate. So you do want to use language like clearly, and I recommend using that word clearly or it is clear. Internal memo or client letter, we don't do that though. Here is an example of distinguishing negative authority. So let's talk about distinguishing negative authority. So in a tax memo, in a memo, internal memo or client letter, we we distinguish negative authority, but we do it in a more objective tone. Now we're doing it in a more firm advocate tone, okay? So here's an example of distinguishing negative authority in a protest letter related to the above facts that we talked about with the house fact pattern for Mr. X. So although the court disallowed the expense deduction in Frank Newcomb, which is a tax court case, the facts were substantially different from those of Mr. X. In the Newcomb case, the taxpayer's daughter used the home as her principal residence throughout the year. Unlike Mr. X's situation, the taxpayer never rented out the residence to any non-family member while he owned the property. So far that looks very similar to our memo, and the last sentence is where it's going to differ. Clearly, the facts in Newcomb case are so materially different from Mr. X's situation as to render the case entirely inapplicable. So that clearly and entirely, we don't usually do that in a client letter or a tax memo unless it is without a doubt, because you have to think about malpractice issues. But when you're representing your client before the IRS, you have to think about this. This language is really important because you do want to take the role of an advocate, because that is what you are doing. That is your role. Frequently, you'll find that you can make alternative arguments in support of the taxpayer. So for our example, what you're going to see in the example below is, as many of you know, I like to talk about when I teach tax, the big three tax activities. You've got business activity, you've got investment activity, and you have personal use, right? Like your personal home that you have, or your personal car that you use for personal purposes, okay? You obviously want business the most of those three because there is less limit on deductions. And there's other reasons, but that's the biggest thing. Then next is investment, and then the worst of those three is personal use, because the general rule under Code Section 262 is that personal use deductions aren't allowed. There has to be a provision that allows it otherwise. Versus for business investment, you are allowed to take it generally, but there's limitations on that, okay? So if you aren't able to get business deduction 162 here, then what you can do is you can then argue in a different light, okay, well, then Section 212, which applies to investment. Okay, which applies to investment. So frequently you will find that you can make alternative arguments in support of the taxpayer. You should present all available arguments, even if they require conflicting assumptions. This is something that is hard to do in a memo, internal memo, because it breaks down, kind of what exactly you're assuming and stuff. And then when you put it in a client letter or whatnot, the client doesn't feel very good about it. But here, with respect to the IRS, you can do this because, again, you're being an advocate. However, do not weaken the case by presenting obviously erroneous or weak arguments. Just make sure you make a clear transition from one argument to the next so that you do not weaken the force of your arguments. So here's an example of transitioning between two arguments in a protest letter related to the above Mr. X fact pattern. So the first argument deals with Code Section 162. The taxpayer is entitled to a deduction under Code Section 162 because the property was rental property, and then you continue. But later on, if in that same protest letter, if you're dealing with this issue of Mr. X, you would want to put something related to Code Section 212, because if you don't put Section 212 in there, then it's possible you don't get any deduction. Even if you find the taxpayer did not have a valid business reason for the deduction, it should still be allowed under the principle that the property was held for investment. So that's getting to Section 212. So what we've just gone through for the last several minutes is about the art of advocacy, and that's a huge difference when you're dealing with IRS writing. So if you're writing to the IRS versus writing to an internal file, right, your own firm or your clients, right? This is now being art of an advocate. So if you're ever writing to the IRS, you are allowed to take on this role. And it's very important to understand that you have to use your skills that you've developed for writing memos and client letters, and now you have to use those same skills, bring them over to these IRS protest letters, determination letters, private letter ruling requests, those types of IRS correspondence. And what you're doing is you also need to make sure you change your tone to make it more as an advocate, okay? So now what I want to do, I want to go through the 10 things. I made a list of 10. I love lists of 10 that are included in the formal written protest letter. And then after that, we're actually going to take an example of a protest letter. So I promised you, I'm going to show you how to write a protest letter. So if you're watching this video and you're like, I'm just here to get to how to write a protest letter, it's coming up in a few minutes. Okay. So here's what should be included in the formal written protest letter. And again, this is set by the IRS. I have 10 things, and it's like 10 different categories. So first, taxpayer's name, address, and a daytime telephone number. Second, a statement the taxpayer wants to appeal the IRS's findings to the Office of Appeals. Again, that's the purpose of the protest letter. If you leave out that idea, then they don't understand why you're writing the letter. Third, because remember, in the 30-day letter, there were multiple options. So you need to make it clear that you are trying to go to the appeals process. You're not trying to talk further about, the issue with the revenue agent. You want to go to the appeals process. Third, a copy of the letter that the taxpayer received that shows the proposed changes. So that would be the 30-day letter along with the revenue agent's report, sometimes referred to as the RAR, that shows why, okay? 4, the tax periods or years involved. 5, a list of each proposed item with which the taxpayer disagrees. So you want to go through and provide why the taxpayer disagrees with these items. The reasons, number 6 is the reasons the taxpayer disagrees with each item. 7, the facts that support the taxpayer's position on each item. 8, the law or authority, if any, that supports the taxpayer's position on each item. 9, the penalties of perjury statement as follows. Under the penalties of perjury, I declare, and this is a statement that I put together that you can use. So under the penalties of perjury, I declare that the facts stated in this protest and any accompanying documents are true, correct, and complete to the best of my knowledge and belief. And then the 10th thing, the taxpayer's signature under the penalties of perjury statement. Okay? And then one thing to note is that if you are a taxpayer's representative, you also need to sign it and note that you prepared this, and you have to do the penalty of perjury, all of those things. Okay? You must substitute a declaration for the penalties of perjury statement, and it must include that he or she, the taxpayer representative, submitted the protest and any accompanying documents, and whether he, she, the taxpayer knows personally that the facts stated in the protest and any accompanying documents are true and correct. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a protest letter. And in some of my videos, I actually walk through with you and I write a protest letter with you. I was going to do that with you, but one thing is that with my examples to the IRS, because it's just so like boilerplate, it's better that I just show you an example, and I'm just going to point to areas where, this is where, you want to keep the same. This is where it's going to change. Okay, so we have an example. This is separate from the Mr. X fact pattern that we've been going through. This is a separate example. It deals with casualty losses, and it's an interesting example. So you're going to have the date. Again, this is the protest letter starting from this page. This is the first page, okay? We're going to have 3 pages that are the protest letter. So this is page 1. So at the top, you want the date of the letter. I said today's date. The date of the letter, okay? Then you want to address it to the group manager you want to address it to the group manager as well as the revenue agent, right? So I have group manager here, but you also want to address it to the revenue agent, okay, that was on the letter. So you want both of those. I do group manager and the revenue agent. You want to obviously address it to the Internal Revenue Service, and you want to address it to the office that they're located. If you don't know, you can just put group manager. You can put also the person's name, or you can just do the revenue agent, whatever you prefer. Then you want to do, what this is regarding, Mr. and Mrs. Smith here. You want to put the identification number for an individual, Social Security or ITIN, right? Identification numbers for an entity, it's going to be the EIN. You also want to put the reference number, which will be provided to you in the 30-day letter. That's that specific generated code in the top right corner, or whatever part of the letter if that changes. And then you say to whom it may concern, and this is where you want to talk about references made to your 30-day letter. So it's in response to the 30-day letter, and the letter form number is provided, dated, whatever date it was here. It's January 15, 20X5, enclosed herewith regarding the proposed adjustment to the casualty loss deduction in the amount of $900,000 claimed by a taxpayer. So we're providing the amount the IRS is trying to adjust. So now you'll see that it's a numbered letter after this. It's numbered with different things. And we're going to have 6 different areas, and then at the bottom you're going to see it's going to be just signature. All right? So keep that in mind. And I recommend, if you're in my class and you're preparing a protest letter, follow these numbers. Follow this, okay? So first you have the taxpayer's name, address, identification number. So you'd provide the taxpayer's name, address, identification number below that. I don't have an address for Mr. and Mrs. Smith's, but you would fill that in. The second item is the date of the 30-day letter. You'd then put that next to it. Third is a taxable year at issue, and that's going to be on the 30-day letter. So let's just say here it's for a year ended December 31st, 20X2. 4, your request for conference. Remember, you must have in the letter the request for conference, and this is what makes it a protest letter. Taxpayers request a conference with the Internal Revenue Office of Appeals, and you provide where it's located, here, San Francisco, California office, with respect to the findings of the examining revenue agent. Now, if you are filling this out, so far, you can just follow this boilerplate approach, obviously changing for the amount, the Social Security number, EIN, ITIN, the name of the person, the entity number, whatever it is, the address to the IRS office. But so far, you can use almost all this language. 5, we get to the facts. Okay, and that's where you're going to provide your facts. And remember, you want to provide the facts in the most favorable light in this protest letter to the appeals. So in our example of Mr. X, we would put, for number 5 facts, we would put the facts that we said in the most favorable light, that last example of how we'd write the facts. So in 20X0, the taxpayers, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, decided to build a house in Northern California. The house was constructed without securing building permits required by the relevant county. In 20X2, a fire swept through the taxpayers' neighborhood completely, destroying their home. This fire was part of a nationally declared disaster, which was part of the Stafford Act, Presidential Declaration Stafford Act. There is no dispute that the taxpayers had no involvement with the fire. The taxpayers claimed a casualty loss deduction of $900,000 on their 20X2 return. So based on, that's the facts, and that's again the most favorable light how we're presenting it. Based on the introductory paragraph, the reference is made to your 30-day letter and that, the proposed adjustment of $900,000, because the casualty loss deduction is $900,000 and there's a proposed adjustment for $900,000 deduction, that means the IRS is completely disallowing this amount. Okay? Then we get to number 6, applicable law, and then what you're doing there is you're basically taking the Internal Revenue Code, you're taking cases, you're taking other you're taking regulations, you're taking other primary sources. You don't want to use secondary sources, primary sources that represent, that are for your side. You don't want to provide both sides, just your side, okay? Just your side. And you want to put that in this section. So if you wrote a memo, you want to go through your memo and you want to pick out the arguments that you put in your memo that support the taxpayer. You want to leave out the sides that are for the IRS. That's for the IRS. That's for them to do. So here, and you want to start, and again, you want to use all those skills that you developed in memo writing. You want to start with the, broad with the code and go down to the regulations and cases and then lower level. You don't want to jump around, and start with something low like a private letter when you want to start with the Internal Revenue Code. So Section 165 allows a deduction for any loss sustained during the taxable year and not compensated for by insurance or otherwise. And you cite and use the same citation that you would in your memo. You use that same citation structure like the Blue Book and whatnot that you've been using in tax. In the case of an individual, the deduction allowed in subsection A is to be limited to losses of property not connected with a trade or business if such losses arise from fire, storm, shipwreck, or other casualty, or from theft. And you provide the citation. There are also various limitations under Section 165H that apply to individual losses, and you cite that. The taxpayers claim clearly, so there's that clearly language, right? You want that firm language, falls within the scope of deduction under Section 165 as, 1, they sustained a loss of $900,000 during the taxable year. 2, it was not compensated by insurance or otherwise. 3, the taxpayers as individuals satisfy the requirements of Section 165C3 since the property, their home, was not connected with a trade or business and the cause of the loss, was fire. And 4, none of the Section 165H loss disallowance rules apply to the taxpayer because this loss comes from a federally declared disaster. So you basically just laid out in a very organized approach, you're explaining why your taxpayer meets this. Now you're saying, okay, well then isn't that it? You could stop there. But remember, you want to provide in this letter all arguments for your taxpayer. So if the IRS was just to provide that part, but obviously the opposite, they could do that. And a lot of time that happens in the revenue agent's report. But you want to go further. You want to anticipate what the IRS is trying to say, but you want to show the authority that says, no, that's incorrect, without saying, any authority that might support their position. So we go through that. Admittedly, courts have disallowed casualty losses deductions where allowance of the deduction would severely and immediately frustrate a sharply defined national or state policy. And I provide, Supreme Court reference, 2 Supreme Courts. Okay. And by the way, here I give a little bit of overview of the Supreme Court case, what happened in that case, just for the appeals. Don't feel necessary you have to do that if you're writing that in my class, but I just wanted to show an example. I kind of talk about what the case is. They affirm this, they deal with disallowance of deductions and fines and theft loss disallowed. So they both deal with to show the appeals officer, hey, tank truck rentals and Ritchie versus Commissioner both deal with deductions. In analyzing whether the allowance of deduction would severely and immediately frustrate a sharply defined national or state policy, courts have looked at various factors. One key factor is whether the taxpayer's activity directly caused the loss. Okay, so what we're getting at here is in the facts, note that the taxpayers did not secure the proper permits. So basically the IRS, what they were trying to say, and of course, if you had the revenue agent's report, it would make more sense because they'd probably be citing to that. Well, they basically say, well, unfortunately, you didn't do this in accordance with, the proper authorities, so you shouldn't be able to get the tax deduction. And we're trying to say, no, that has no bearing on it, okay? That has nothing to do with what's going on here. And I cite Blackman and Holt. And there I didn't provide the overview of the case because, well, honestly, they're not as relevant as the other 2 were deductions. With respect to the taxpayer's claim, the following aspects are relevant. 1, there's no dispute that the taxpayers had no involvement with the fire, which I give an example of Blackman intentionally started the fire. I'm sorry, that's why in the Blackman decision, I don't give, I was thinking about, something different. In the Blackman, I didn't provide a little gist about it because I talk about Blackman and Holt later on. That's why, okay? Or at least Blackman. I talk about Blackman there. That's why. And casualty loss was not directly related to the taxpayer's failure to obtain permits. So it's not, like a proximate cause or a direct correlation to that happening, a direct cause or proximate cause. And the loss would have occurred regardless. So even if the permits were acquired, the loss would have still occurred. And that's basically under the Commissioner versus Henninger case. That's really important to understand. Okay. The mere fact that an expenditure bears a remote relation to an illegal act does not make it non-deductible. And again, I cite Commissioner versus Henninger. Courts have also examined whether allowing the loss would defeat the purpose of the laws that the taxpayer violated or alleviate the sting of any punishment imposed on the taxpayer for violation of the statute. And then I provide the Murillo case and the TC memo, and I also cite what happened there in a little parenthetical. The taxpayer facts are distinguishable as state has specific punitive measures for property owners who do not obtain the required building permits. So the idea here is don't punish our taxpayer twice. They can be punished already by the state of California for, not getting the proper permits. But here, don't punish them again just because they didn't get the permits and now they're not able to get this benefit of the deduction. Okay, when they weren't able to get insurance on their house. That's basically what's going on, proper reimbursement when the fire burned it down in a federally declared disaster. Allowing taxpayers casualty loss deduction would have no impact on these punitive measures. So that's really, what controls, and I cite the Roars case, and again, another little parenthetical. Apart from the above, in facts that were substantially similar to taxpayers, the IRS has also provided favorable guidance on casualty loss deduction, and I cite an IRS chief counsel advice. The issue under consideration was whether the taxpayers may be denied a casualty loss deduction under Code Section 165C3. So example here, for 2 uninsured structures that were built without the requisite permits and were destroyed in a fire. The IRS concluded that there were not sufficient grounds to deny taxpayers a casualty loss based on public policy considerations. So that's very, very similar to our case. Now, we can't just cite the IRS chief counsel advice because while it's a primary authority, it's non-binding. So we need to set it up by citing primary authorities that are binding, which are the code as well as these cases, and then we get to the chief counsel, which is even more similar to our case. In conclusion, the taxpayer's claim for casualty loss deduction is clearly, and by the way, in your conclusion, you definitely want to use the clearly language. We use the clearly language, right, that firm language already in this part in number 6, right, showing the authorities, but we want to use it even further. Okay, so clearly covered under Section 165. The casualty loss was not directly related to taxpayers' failure to obtain permits, a key factor considered by the courts. And I cite to Blackman and Holt. Also, since the state has specific punitive measures for property owners who did not obtain the required building permits, allowing the loss would not defeat the purpose of the laws that the taxpayer violated or alleviate the sting of any punishment imposed on the taxpayers for violation of the statute. And I cite again to Murillo and Roars. Lastly, the claim for casualty loss deduction is consistent with the IRS guidance on the issue, which is the chief counsel advice provided. So that's the end of that section of the memorandum of authority and basically the heart of the protest letter. So now we're getting to the procedural aspect. The attached protest was prepared by the taxpayer's representative, CPA, and you provide the name, and then you also provide your power of attorney, which at this time Form 2848 was the power of attorney form, on the basis of information available to him. All statements contained therein are true to the best of his knowledge and belief. Sincerely, and you cite to the CPA and you sign it, and you enclose 30-day letter, which also includes a report, and Form 2848, which here at this time was the power of attorney. So that is an example of how to write a protest letter, as well as going through what exactly a protest letter is and the advocacy tone. So make sure you go back through this. Again, if you're creating a protest letter in my class, you can follow this protest letter, the same language, pretty much to the T. Obviously, the part with the law, that's going to be different because it's going to be a different issue. If I'm giving you an example, I'll provide you with some law in my example, but just keep in mind that the rest of the protest letter, I keep saying report, rest of the protest letter should follow, the same 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with that information. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this. Now, if you're out there trying to fill a protest letter, you know how to do this. And again, don't always rely on this stuff because it changes in the future, but this is going to help you with that issue.